Have some folks here this evening representing both KPMG and First Niagara, corporate supporters of the Council, who we thank for their generosity, which helps enable us to do our work with students, creation, as we like to say, of global citizens. Before we get to the substance of the program, I want to do a little commercial for our next event on March 12th. We have the next in our Great Debates series titled In Sickness and in Health, American Healthcare in the Age of Obamacare, which will feature Bill Frist, former United States Senate Majority Leader, Dr. Zeke Emanuel of the University of Pennsylvania, in addition to nearly a dozen other expert speakers who will discuss various aspects of public policy related to healthcare and indeed various aspects of the question of healthcare. On to tonight's program. For the past 30 years, as you all know, China has transformed from an impoverished country where peasants comprise the largest portion of the population to an economic powerhouse with an expanding middle class and more megacities than anywhere else on Earth. Like every other major power in modern history, China is looking outward to find the massive quantities of resources needed to continue its economic expansion, and it is now engaged in a far-flung quest around the world for fuel, ores, water, farmland, and other natural resources. Chinese traders and investors buy commodities with consequences for the world economy, for local economies, for people, and for the environment all around the world. Meanwhile, the Chinese military aspires to secure sea lanes to protect those resource flows, and of course Chinese diplomacy works to protect what it perceives as the country's interests abroad, including that supply of resources. Tonight we have with us Dr. Michael Levi, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations, who will explore with us China's pursuit of raw materials and where that may take the country and indeed the world in coming years. At the end of the program tonight, the book, By All Means Necessary, How China's Resource Quest is Changing the World, co-authored with Elizabeth Economy, will be available for purchase and signing. We've decided to do this program as a conversation rather than a sort of set-piece lecture. So I'm going to ask our distinguished guests some questions. And after that, in due course, of course, you will have the opportunity to ask your questions as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Levi. First question, which is the only one that we choreograph, is why did you decide to use the sort of provocative and, in a different context, familiar phrase, by all means necessary, to title the book?
So first, thanks Craig and everyone for having me here this evening. The actual story behind it is my publisher sent Liz and I an email one day, said we've all gotten together our greatest minds and come up with a fantastic title for your book, The Hungry Dragon. And my co-author immediately flipped out. She said, I've been working on China for 25 years, and one thing I've sworn is I will never have a book with the word dragon in the title. So I failed to keep it out of the title of the event tonight, but she's not here. So we started to think about other options, and somehow By All Means Necessary just hit me as a title that really captured the span, the unusual span of the book. You talked about the different resources that China is looking at, from oil and gas to minerals to land to water. But the counterpart to that in the book is that we look at an enormous range of tools that China is using to provide security for those resource supplies. It is trading, it's investing, it's using its political relationships, at least to try and increase, in the minds of its policymakers the security of some of its resource supplies, and it's playing around with its military posture to try and make sure that it has the resource security that it seeks. So there's an enormous set of means that China is using to secure resources, and the title is really a reference to that. Now, by all means necessary sounds very aggressive in some ways, but the word necessary, I think, is important there too. Not all means possible or all means that might pop into someone's mind, all means necessary. China is using a range of tools, but it's being pragmatic on a lot of fronts, doing what it and its leaders think is necessary.
Should Americans be worried about the Chinese need for a global resource base and these means that they are seeking to acquire those resources?
So there are an enormous number of claims out there about why we should be worried. We should be worried because China is driving prices through the roof. We should be worried because they're locking up materials through their investments. We should be worried because they're about to kick us out of the Middle East and take control of the sea lanes. We should be worried because they're going to distort diplomacy on Iran and Sudan and what have you. If we were worried about every one of those things, we wouldn't have the resources ourselves, the political and economic and military resources to respond effectively. But if we, if it were inappropriate for us to be worried about any of that, I think first I'd be wasting my time writing a book like this. But I think we would be missing some real challenges. And so one of the things we're really trying to do in this book is figure out which of these big claims are real and which aren't, so that we can respond effectively to the ones that matter. And I highlight two or maybe three that really stand out to me. So you see a lot of fascinating stories about what's happening on the ground when China invests in resources. And investment makes for interesting stories. There are Chinese workers and managers and companies doing this, that, or the other in exotic countries around the world. But where the biggest impacts have been so far from China's resource quest is not through investment, it's through trade. So Chinese consumers and Chinese traders, as they buy resources, drive up prices. And we saw massive price increases for oil in particular, but also for iron ore and for copper over the last decade. Those price increases have had consequences well beyond the countries where China invests. They have consequences for any country that produces those materials because they're fetching a higher price. That's a good consequence for a lot of those. They have consequences for other consumers of those materials. And in the case of the United States, big consequences for American consumers because of the higher price of oil. And we can talk later about how you might respond if you think that these are significant threats, but the impact on prices. There isn't a great character, there aren't a pair of players that clash out on some battlefield, but that is probably the sharp end of the spear when it comes to the impact of China's resource quest on the world. At the other end of the spectrum, and this is more going out in the future, is the potential impact of China's desire to provide some of that physical security that underpins its resource trade. I think the talk about how China is establishing all sorts of bases and is about to take a role in the Middle East soon, and that's exaggerated. That's not calibrated to China's actual capabilities or actual actions. But when we look a bit closer to China, at things like the free flow of resources through the South and East China Seas, places where China in principle, particularly as we go out a decade or so, could have the capacity to try and replace the United States as a provider for security in the resource trade. I think those are places where you could see the potential for real clashes.
So those are the claims that are made about sort of legitimate concerns for the United States based on China's quest for resources. What would you say? Again, obviously you're summarizing here, but what are the fundamental American policy responses that you think are appropriate for the concerns you think are legitimate?
So we could have an entire conversation about that, but let me talk about maybe one of the ones I just highlighted and then another. So to the extent that China is driving up prices, the most immediate way that the United States needs to respond is by making itself less economically vulnerable to those price increases. So if oil prices are going up, we need to do a better job of becoming more efficient in our use of oil. That not only makes our economy less vulnerable to high prices, but it also takes some pressure off those prices and reduces them for everyone. Some of that happens through technology, some through markets, but it also happens through government action, regulation. We saw yesterday or the day before the president talk about new fuel economy standards for heavy trucks. So there's steps that you can take in that dimension. You can look at this resource after resource. You also want to respond on the supply side. We see, again, in energy, the U.S. responding, but also in other materials. So in rare earths, for example, which have gotten a lot of attention, these are materials that are critical to a lot of not only energy applications, but other high-tech and defense applications. We've seen a significant supply response from the United States and others that also helps alleviate some of that scarcity that has developed. Now, not every material requires this kind of response. Take iron ore, for example. The United States, net exporter of iron ore. That's not the exposure isn't the same in all cases, but there are a lot where this is a critical way we need to think about things. Let me take another one, because here's another place where China does have a significant impact. Chinese companies bring a set of behaviors and governance standards from home when they go out abroad, right? So just like an American company that goes abroad and sort of takes what it knows with it, Chinese companies take what they know with them. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, the Chinese companies don't know a lot of the best practices. When a Chinese company goes to Zambia, it doesn't take best practices on doing environmental impact assessments with it. It doesn't take best practices for labor with it. When I was in Zambia a year or two ago, I met with a government official who told me that at one point a Chinese company had submitted an environmental impact statement in Chinese. It had been approved, despite the fact that no one in the Zambian government spoke Chinese. So that's problematic. Now, what does that mean for our response in that kind of front? Well, we can have one of two responses. We can say, look, we need to lower the standards for American companies operating abroad so they can fight on a level playing field. Or we can say, we need to hold American companies and companies that are doing contracts with organizations like the World Bank where we have influence, we need to hold them to a higher standard and help raise the bar for everyone. And I think we found in our research that a lot of the time that effort to raise the bar is actually very useful to internal advocates of reform in these countries who are trying to raise the standards. And we found that when you do get the standards raised, the Chinese ultimately meet them. So they evolve, they grow, they respond to that pressure from the international system. But only if that pressure is there, and so that's one of the responses we need to have, is to make sure we continue to advocate high standards.
So you are not overly concerned about the broad claim that the Chinese, by bringing into the field lower standards, if you will, with respect to the environment, with respect to labor, are undercutting us in an unfair way?
I think there are occasions where they undercut us. I think there's very little question about that. And I think that in countries with weak capacity, a Chinese company is going to generally perform worse than a Western company. Again, Western companies in a lot of these fields haven't covered themselves in glory a lot of the time. But broadly, they tend to perform better, particularly in industries where they're highly visible with global reputations to protect. But I don't necessarily see this sort of broad-based fundamental undercutting. And what's particularly interesting, again, is in the places where the Western companies perform a bit better, the Chinese companies are actually taking advantage of opportunities that that's created. So take Peru as an example. In the early days, Chinese company Shigang Hero went into Peru. It was a real disaster on a variety of different fronts. And two things happened. First, there's a reaction back in China. The Chinese government starts to appreciate that this hurts the country's standing. But also, Peru raises its standards. More Western companies come in. And they, over time, They develop a cadre of trained local managers. They develop a network of local consultants that can help with everything from environmental impact assessments to setting up healthcare for workers and the whole gamut. And then the Chinese companies come back in, they go and take advantage of that network. They take advantage of the infrastructure that's built up. And so you see this in Peru, where more recent Chinese entrants in the mining sector have performed a lot better because of these two different pressures, this set of changes coming from within China, but this new set of tools that's available for them to actually raise their level of performance.
Is the Chinese global resource quest actually a broader net at this point than the American involvement in the world with respect to resources? We hear a lot in the United States about the Chinese sort of monopolizing, if you will, Africa and the development of African resources. Are they sort of catching up to us? Have they passed us? Is that a concern we need to worry about?
So China is, I believe, the #4 investor in Africa. The United States is still on top. China is not even the top Asian investor in Africa. It ranks behind Malaysia. China is a large source of incremental investment into a lot of these places, and that matters. But it's important to keep this within scale. I mean, American investments are huge and global, and in the resource space, Canadian, Australian investments are also very large. It's interesting you framed it as, is China much more broadly active than the United States? Because I think in a lot of people's minds it's the opposite. The United States is global, China is focusing on Africa, or focusing on Central Asia, and thereby really achieving a level of dominance that the United States, which isn't strategic in its investments, because these are private investments, doesn't achieve. But when you look out there, China is actually genuinely global. And it's not just global in the developing world in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of Latin America or in Central Asia. It's increasingly interested in resource investments in very much developed economies, in Canada, in Australia, and in the United States. We just saw an announcement of a deal yesterday or the day before. I'm still trying to unravel exactly what's going on, but a Chinese gold jewelry processing company is apparently, they bid something like $700 million to buy an oil and gas producer in Texas. Now, what is a gold jewelry processing company doing in that business? I think it remains to be determined. But there's this interest in part because that's where the resources are. That's where a lot of the resource opportunities are. You want to develop iron ore? Go to Australia. You want to develop natural gas right now? Go to the United States. And so you're seeing Chinese companies attracted there. By the way, that's another factor pushing up the level of performance of some of these companies. I think on two different ways. The first is they need to perform better so that their reputations don't get in the way of their ability to invest in these countries. But also the experience of operating in these countries it provides a learning opportunity that is then carried elsewhere, particularly when you're talking to the very big Chinese companies, especially in the energy space, that are active on a genuinely global basis.
You haven't talked much yet about the environmental impacts of the increased consumption of resources and the extraction and so on. So can you talk about that as to what sort of China's, we hear a lot about China's internal environmental issues, but the Chinese sort of global environmental impact.
And of course the book on the internal consequences of Chinese industrialization on its environment and what that means for China more broadly is a book that my co-author wrote almost 10 years ago, and it was really ahead of its time in anticipating the sorts of things that we're seeing now. Look, globally, I think you want to look at two pieces. The first is growing Chinese demand for resources means that more resources are being developed, whoever is developing them. And a lot of the resource extraction business is a messy business. And so you have environmental consequences from that around the world. I'm someone who thinks that increased oil and gas extraction in this country is good news, but it comes with environmental consequences, and we wouldn't be seeing that increased extraction had China not driven up the prices for a lot of these resources. So that's an attenuated connection, but it's a connection that really is critical there. Now there's a separate question of, well, what happens when it's a Chinese company doing the development rather than a Western company, and regardless of whether whatever they're producing is being shipped back to China or not. And there, I think, the big variable is the capacity of the country where China invests. In a country with weak governance capacity, Chinese investment is going to lead to a worse performance on the environment. China is not bringing higher quality activity and stepping up the game. In places where the governance is strong, the Chinese companies, some of them may try to circumvent that governance, but they actually have limited effectiveness. You know, when we were writing the book, Liz went to Brazil and was talking to them about land investment. And there's a lot of hesitancy in Brazil. There's a long-standing aversion to selling land to foreigners. But on top of that, there's a hesitancy because of the environmental impacts of Chinese agriculture at home. And a lot of folks in Brazil are wary. And she saw Chinese officials going there thinking that they could circumvent all of this concern by just going to the local officials and saying, okay, we know how it's done. Sort it all out. This is one of the reasons that there's not a lot of actual realized land investment from China in Brazil, because that's not actually how it's done. Brazil is a place with pretty decent capacity to govern these things.
You led right to my next question, which is about the level of corruption in the Chinese resource industry and their efforts to extract. I mean, where would you place that on the scale of tools in their arsenal and means they consider necessary? Let's put it down.
It's a tool that they are able to use. I think it's the fact that the companies aren't necessarily so well governed, but it's also, in some cases, the ability to appeal to political leaders to deal with things on their behalf. Right? Not every country is like Brazil in the way that I just described. There's a question about how good that actually is for the Chinese companies over the long run. So a lot of the corruption happens through, I don't know if it's technically corruption, it's using relationships at the highest level to make things happen rather than working through established rules and procedures. Now, if those rules and procedures don't really exist, I don't know if you exactly call it corruption, but it's basically, it has the same consequence. That works very well for Chinese companies when the leaders stick around. But there have been enough experiences at this point where leadership changes, whether it's in Papua New Guinea or Zambia or elsewhere, and a lot of the deals that seem to be done no longer are. And not only do the Chinese have to come back in and try again, but they're on the outs with the new leadership, the new political leadership in these countries. And that actually can cause them problems. And this is one of these things that we find consistently is, again, you bring the instincts you have from home when you go abroad. Chinese corporate leaders, particularly ones that aren't hugely experienced abroad, have an instinct that identifies the ruling party with the state. It's natural. It's not the case in a lot of places. And that gets revealed when the ruling party changes and the state is still there.
We talked a fair amount about the impact of the Chinese expansion on the United States. Let's try and look at some other countries as well. So, have the Chinese sort of squeezed out the Japanese? Obviously, Japan, a place that needs to import basically all its raw materials. So, how is that competition looking?
So, let me take a step back. I love that you brought up Japan. One of the things we look at early in the book is the history of rising powers going out to secure resources. And a lot of people think that what's happened with China is unprecedented, and it may be in some ways, but you can actually trace the pattern very far back to ancient Athens, probably before, if we had the right records, and as recently as Japan. And not only do you see a big push from Japan in the 1960s and 1970s to go out to secure resources, sometimes the scale of that is even larger than China's state, or similar in scale to China's. You have Japan buying about 1/10 of the world's oil at one point. But you also, if you look at the reactions in American political and media circles, very, very similar. And you go and read some of what was written. Very similar concerns about locking up resources, about fundamentally different ways of doing business, fundamentally different attitudes toward markets. And it turns out that Japan has not upended the global system for resource trade and resource security. Now, is that proof that China won't? Absolutely not. But it should at least clear the decks a bit, and I hope open people's minds to the possibility that not every sort of massive upsurge in demand for resources fundamentally changes everything. That the system is pretty resilient in a lot of ways. Now, you asked, is China squeezing out Japan? And again, I think we need to separate trade and investment. Investment is where we typically look, and it seems to be zero-sum. Japanese companies are still pretty active in investing abroad. They don't have huge incremental demand. They don't necessarily need to go out, for example, their steel mills don't necessarily need to go out and buy stakes in a lot more iron ore mines. Where China is squeezing Japan and others out effectively is by pushing up prices. What do you do when you push up prices? You make it so that a whole bunch of players who previously found it worthwhile to buy a particular material, to do this, that, or the other thing with it, no longer find it worthwhile because it's expensive. And in that sense, China is squeezing Japan and everyone else out. But that's how it happens. It's not because two people go to the table and one says, I'll pay more than you. It happens through the market and through prices.
So before the 1960s, before World War II, the rising power of Japan thought of the control of resources in militarized terms. What level of concern do you have about the Chinese looking towards a militarized approach?
Well, I mean, Japan quite rightly thought of access to resources as a military issue, and it discovered it had affirmed during World War II that when someone cuts your access to resources, you are in deep trouble when it comes to the functioning of your military. And Chinese policymakers are certainly scared about what would happen to them in a conflict, particularly with the United States, if their access to resources, in this case especially oil, was cut off. The Chinese military tends to believe that the United States could cut off its access to oil, to outside oil, during a crisis. It's tried a variety of responses, some of which make more sense than others. And there was some theory at some point that investing in overseas resources would help. That never made sense to a lot of us because ownership doesn't matter if you can't get the stuff back. And this is people talk about how China is buying resources in Venezuela to increase its security, investing in oil there. I mean, Venezuela ranks pretty high on my list of places that the United States could stop from shipping oil if there were a conflict with China. It's developing pipelines that give it access over land to resource flows, to oil and to gas. And there's sometimes this reaction from security analysts to say, well, if we could stop the flows through a sea lane, well, we could also bomb pipelines. Yes, but attacking deep within a large country is that's escalatory. That provides some resilience. And they also are doing things like developing strategic stocks, which sometimes appear to make limited sense from an economic perspective. If China were blockaded, these strategic stocks would last a few weeks, and then they'd be through, and people still have to drive less or stop taking airplanes. But if you look at the value of those strategic stocks to keep their aircraft running during a conflict with Taiwan, much more significant, much more consequential. So they certainly have thought about this, and are looking at different ways to deal with it. Now, obviously, the ultimate way to deal with this is to develop the ability to keep those resource flows open, to stop any blockade during a conflict. I think that's farther away. China is certainly increasing its naval capabilities, but there is a strong draw to focus any incremental capabilities on the challenges very close to home. And you can imagine in a conflict over Taiwan that you would see China at a minimum torn if it tried to take assets and use them to keep sea lanes open so that they could be getting resources. Those are assets that couldn't be deployed to deal with the immediate conflict.
what's the relationship between the global reach that you've described versus in sort of intensification of extraction efforts at home? I mean, China's a big place. Are they maxed out in terms of resource development?
I don't know that they're fundamentally maxed out. They have big pressures on it. You have to look resource by resource. So if you look at agriculture, they have enormous pressures on their land. They have pollution. They have water constraints. All of these things that, can they increase the application of technology? Sure. But even that requires, to get the incentives right, probably requires changes in land tenure and things like that that require difficult political decisions. So there are soft constraints. If you look, in some places the reserves or the resource just can't match it. So iron ore, for example, they are going to import this. If you look at oil and gas, they're not maxed out, but they need to be able to bring in technology from abroad in order to extract more. And that, by the way, is another piece of this story. We look at each of these investments and ask how much stuff are they getting. In a lot of cases, the goal is not to get stuff. It's to learn about the technology, to learn about management, to learn about the other pieces that make for a successful extractive effort so they can take those and apply those at home. So when a Chinese company goes and invests in natural gas production in Texas or in Pennsylvania, it's not because it's expecting to ship that natural gas back to China. It's hoping to ship the expertise that it gains through working there back to China and apply it to its own resources. But these things take time. All of these things take time, and they all again face these competing pressures, again, whether it's from land or from water.
I'd like to open it up for questions from the floor here. Please.
I have so many questions, I'll try to control myself. But maybe the best way to ask this question is, it seems to me that China needs us as much as we need them. They need us for our expertise. We need them for their ability to produce at prices that we can afford. But now they're moving in the direction of selling their product internally, the country that is, as you well know. And that's a whole new ballgame. What's that going to change between the relationship between our two countries, the fact that they're going to be moving towards their own people and where they can sell a product, and the need for technology with us?
So that's a fantastic question that goes well beyond resources. To some extent, if Chinese policymakers and business leaders believe that they need outside markets less, they're going to be less cooperative, particularly in setting the rules for global trade, with much broader consequences. And I think there are, I'm sure, a range of opinions within China about the continued importance of outside markets like the United States to China's development. They're not going to flip to an internal consumption-led growth pattern overnight, something they've been trying to do for a long time, limited success. It's one of these things that economists will tell you is an obvious step you need to take, but politically it's very difficult to make happen. But you also pinpointed a reason that even as Chinese consumption turns inward, that there's this external dependence, and that is technology. And one of the places that we saw over and over as we were researching the book where the United States and other Western countries still have an edge is in technology. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, both related to Iran, to the standoff over the Iranian nuclear program. So first, there was a big effort to get Chinese companies to not come in and replace Western companies as they exited Iran. And at least one point in some of these discussions, it was informally communicated by U.S. policymakers, U.S. observers, that if Chinese companies went into Iran and picked up the slack, they might be looked upon with less favor when they try to come and invest in the United States, in American oil and gas. And Chinese companies appear to have decided that access to the technology and the management skill, all those pieces they want from the United States, was more important than stepping into some of these opportunities in Iran. So that's one source of leverage. Another one that's actually similar, on some occasions, as I understand, on some occasions where Chinese companies considered going into Iran and replacing Western ones, there were critical pieces of equipment that they could not supply themselves. Some of those high technology applications that were essential to their operations could only come from European suppliers. And they still needed access to that. So this technological edge, to the extent that we sustain it, still provides us with a source of leverage, even if Chinese companies can achieve scale in all sorts of other areas.
Please.
I lived in Shanghai for a while, a couple of years ago, and I saw what appeared to me to be a colossal real estate bubble. I mean, scores of empty apartment buildings and office buildings just standing there. What is the relationship between the Chinese management of the domestic economy and their role in the world economy?
It's absolutely enormous. And phenomena like the one you're describing make it particularly difficult for us to project future Chinese resource demand. Chinese resource demand is driven in part by consumption, but in part by infrastructure build-out. And if infrastructure trends are distorted by these, by this sort of overinvestment, then our ability to project into the future is going to be compromised. We look at these sort of sources of potential uncertainty in future Chinese resource demand and what their consequences might be. And you really identify three big sources. And the first is the one that came from in the initial question: is China going to be more? Is China going to focus more on internal consumption rather than exports? The second is the one that you're talking about, and what's going to be the pace of urbanization? How resource intensive is that going to be? And the third, which is related to that, is how is technology exploited as China continues with this urbanization? There are ways to build buildings that use different amounts of steel, that use different amounts of cement, that use different amounts of copper and aluminum, and so on. And those have enormous consequences for the global economy because of their impact on resource prices. So now you can go much more broadly than this, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the broader Chinese economy, but certainly the pace of urbanization and the details of urbanization are enormously consequential. Now, I should be clear that not everything is consequential for every resource. So what we're talking about is very important for future iron ore demand, for future copper demand, not so important for future oil demand, or even for future soybean and grain demand. And so you have to distinguish between these different resources and the impacts that these patterns within China have on them.
Please.
In your opening statement, you mentioned that their quest for more water, I believe. Tell us about how are they going to do that, and how critical is it?
So water is very different from the other resources we examine. For every other resource we examine, China goes out in a direct way, whether it's through trade or investment, to secure resources. When we're looking at water, what we're talking about is Chinese efforts to steer water within its own borders to agricultural applications, energy applications, or to harness it for hydropower. And China is upstream of a host of countries in the region in some very critical waterways. And so as it tries to steer water toward agriculture, energy, or hydropower, it has big impacts or threatens to have big impacts on a host of countries downstream. And we saw a few things. Firstly, some of this is exaggerated. You can see these hysterical worries in the Indian press about China just essentially, steering enormous amounts of water, and I'm forgetting the word that's the counterpart of starving, but really setting off huge conflicts with India. And when you look at the engineering fundamentals of these projects people talk about, they're not there. But there are others where you look at it and there are real issues. So you can look at some of the activities upstream of Cambodia and Vietnam, and there are genuine concerns both about impacts on water quality, but also impacts on the seasonality of the river flow which matters. You hydropower high up, and you dam up rivers, and you create reservoirs. You change the seasonality of the river flow, which has huge impacts on agriculture downstream. You have these large consequences. You see, I think Chinese response has fallen into two categories. Initially, they basically said, this is none of your business, sovereign issue, inside China. Increasingly, they're willing to engage in technical cooperation, greater transparency, greater monitoring, greater data sharing, so that there is better understanding downstream of what's going on. What they are still unwilling to do, at least most of the time, is to have serious substantive discussions about resource sharing. When you have a constrained water resource, to talk about who gets how much of it and how they're going to manage that. So the data sharing is great if you're just talking about a phantom issue and people are scared about nothing. Data sharing doesn't do too much if all the data sharing does is reinforce the fact that downstream countries are going to be without the water that they want or need. And there's a big open question about whether China will come around on that second piece. I don't think China feels threatened that Cambodia or Vietnam will come and enter militarily to try and sort out their water issues. Will they see other places where maybe they can resolve a water issue and they get access to a market or to a development opportunity? And that remains to be seen. That's a more likely prospect.
Please.
Excuse me. Some years ago, I think it was Unocal. The Chinese had a deal to buy Unocal, which the government eventually said no, and for security reasons. And I guess Chevron bought them. But the most recent one that I find interesting is the second largest U.S. pork producer, which will the U.S. government look at this deal in a similar way from a security standpoint, not from an environmental or protecting us from protecting our food? That might be an interesting issue, but will they look at it from a grand strategy standpoint and either potentially turn it down, or B, extract something very attractive for us if they are willing to approve it?
So this is the Smithfield acquisition. Let's come back to it in 1 second, because I think it's important to get the Unocal piece straight. In the absence of strong, clear guidance from the United States government, a lot of players, not just in the United States but in China, use that case and whatever their recollection of it is to basically tell them what our real policy is. I mean, the reality is that the U.S. government did not reject that acquisition. It was withdrawn because there was a lot of political noise being made about the potential for that. Chevron did not just happen to be there and come in afterwards and bid for the company. Chevron wanted to acquire the company for less money. And on top of all that, the Chinese were not well advised and they went in as themselves rather than with a local subsidiary, all sorts of basic legal things that one might do differently, that have been done differently by more sensitive foreign companies in the past. But the lesson, regardless, that the Chinese took from that is don't try to do this sort of thing. And what you've seen in recent years on the energy front is that Chinese companies do minority stakes, and what they've been doing also is co-investing in certain pieces of certain sort of tracts that companies control. So they don't even go in and take a minority stake in Chesapeake. They take a 49% stake in the following pieces of property of mineral rights that Chesapeake owns and co-develop them. This is, by the way, why I think this weird gold company acquisition announced yesterday is interesting. It's small, it's strange, it happens to be the first attempt, as best I can tell, to take a majority stake in a U.S. oil and gas producer since that Unocal blow up. And I think that will be an interesting one to watch for that reason. By the way, not a state-owned company, so who knows, even if the Chinese government knew much of what was happening. I think that's a more likely place to see a security review than with the Smithfield acquisition. There is a tension among people who think about our CFIUS process, the review process that we have, between whether it should be only honest to goodness national security stuff. You know, are you close to a military installation? Are you going to use your position in the U.S. market to execute cyber attacks and this sort of thing? Answer economic security. I don't think that a food acquisition is the place where they are going to go and reevaluate that question of should we shade more into the economic security part of things. I think it will be some sort of minerals or energy acquisition that will eventually happen that forces that. Just like in Canada, the senior takeover of Nexon sort of forced that discussion, and that's roughly how it will happen eventually in the United States. To the extent that there is concern drummed up about the Smith bill thing, it will be about product safety.
Is it not reasonable to suggest that the Chinese are more vulnerable in the long run relative to food than energy? If one looks at who are the large exporters and who have the surplus and will have it for
Right.
years to come.
I think that's right. I also think that, look, investing in overseas resources, owning it is a fairly limited source of security, but particularly in the case of food. When you have, look, if I'm importing natural gas from Mozambique and there's a market crisis, there's only so much natural gas Mozambique can use, no matter how bad the crisis is. So I'm going to still be able to import it. If I'm importing food from Mozambique and the market goes haywire and prices are going through the roof, it's enormously politically sensitive. It doesn't matter whether I own it or not, they're going to stop me from taking that food out and shipping it home. So as a strategy for sort of security in this hard sense, overseas ownership seems particularly peculiar when it comes to food. I think a lot of the time you have to understand these companies' activities. I said in one case through technology management, but the other is they're big companies. Their CEOs want to be successful. They want to find big acquisition opportunities and big development opportunities. They're going to go where the action is. And if you want to invest in a big food company to import products, the United States is a pretty good place to go and look for an investment. So sometimes the sort of obvious commercial answer works. The Chinese have tools, and this is part of this by all means necessary piece. They have tools that others might not have, but given those tools, they're seeking profits. And one of the key things you do when you seek profits is look for very large opportunities.
Please.
In terms of rare earth minerals, what would be the best U.S. policy for their own security?
So I think we're actually seeing a strong market response on rare earths, right? We've seen supply side response. We're seeing Mountain Pass redevelop. This is out in California near the Nevada border. We're seeing other rare earth deposits developed elsewhere. I think that should be a sufficient response, assuming it doesn't get squelched. So the appropriate U.S. response is to make sure that while we enforce our environmental regulations, that these things don't get gummed up for inappropriate reasons. But also, I think you want to, this is one of those places where you don't want Chinese companies buying the asset. And you see Australia has blocked it, Australia blocked the Chinese rare earths acquisition, and you'll probably see that elsewhere. This is a place where China had about 95% of the market, so you want to make sure that that market becomes more diversified. I'll say, by the way, the attention got drawn to rare earths a few years ago when there was a China-Japan confrontation, and China put a tight quota on rare earths exports, probably to punish Japan. And it was read in the media as a sign of things to come, that this is going to be something that China will use going out into the future as a weapon. I think at least equally plausible explanation is that China saw this supply response already developing, because it was already developing, and figured that it wasn't going to have the same leverage if it tried to do this 2 or 3 years down the road. And so it may be that Chinese leaders decided to use the leverage while they could. Now, did it produce anything useful for them? I don't think so. I think it produced a lot of antagonism and concern about the Chinese dominance of this particular resource. But it may have been more of a now or never action than a sign of things to come. But I should say one more thing on the rare earths, and this comes back to what we're talking about the appropriate response, right? So just because China is doing something doesn't mean that the appropriate response has to focus on confronting China. This is another case where promoting alternatives and technology development is a really important front for responding.
Back.
Can you talk about the skill set shortage in China and how that could be a potential opportunity? I mean, for example, I know there's a high demand for pilots over in China, and just in how that could potentially lead to opportunity for the United States in that area.
So that sounds fascinating. I just am not an expert on these other parts of the Chinese economy. I won't pretend to be one. I think there are important opportunities in the resource space to apply American management skills, but in sort of places with much broader needs for labor, that goes to much bigger questions about not just trade in goods and services, but sort of mobility of people and all these things. They're a very, very interesting area, but I won't pretend to know anything about it. Please.
Yeah, with regards to China's voracious appetite for lumber and its impact on deforestation in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and other spots, can you talk a little bit about trends you see in that area, and also with climate change out there, to what extent will China show any sensitivity in that regard and shift the nature of materials they're using for their development?
So China certainly has a massive piece of demand for lumber, and we talked about the range of places where China has a lesser or greater environmental impact. Chinese companies are involved in illegal logging in a lot of the world, and that is a place where governance standards tend to typically be weak, and Chinese companies are able to exploit them. Particularly, these aren't typically big companies that have sort of high levels of reputation that need to deal with the impact to their stocks trading in New York or something like that. So China has a huge impact there. And again, it's not just through Chinese investment, it is through Chinese trade. And so it doesn't matter who is doing the logging. If China has the demand there, you're cutting down trees, it has local environmental impact, but also global impact. When it comes to climate, I would look to other resource areas to see a sort of convergence between China's efforts to deal with its resource demand and China's potentially positive impact on dealing with climate change. So I would sooner look to Chinese efforts to reduce its oil consumption because of security concerns, because of economic concerns, but with climate consequences, with good climate consequences. I would look to something like that sooner than I would look to China to try and cut back on its timber demand with broader implications, for example, for deforestation in Brazil or in Indonesia.
Has everything that you discussed tonight, is it consistent with China's strategic planning for the next 5 years, or whatever phase we happen to be into in regards to their 5-year plan?
It's certainly consistent with it. I think not everything that China does is in its 5-year plan. Not everything that is in a Chinese 5-year plan actually gets done. China is evolving. So 15 years ago, China was quite focused on securing resources through overseas ownership. It set up a series of incentives to promote that activity. It had lists of resources you should invest in. It set up schemes through its banks to provide low-cost financing if you were investing in those resources, and so companies went and did it. If you look earlier this week or maybe last week, a senior party official published a long paper in People's Daily talking about how they should be looking at their energy strategy going out. There's almost no mention of this sort of going out, purchasing resources abroad. But does that mean that the financial incentives are going to go away, or that the leaders of companies are going to decide now that it won't help them get promoted when they go and do these things? I don't think it will. So there's an enormous lag in the system, even when some of that thinking changes. It's part of a broader issue as well. Chinese leaders are pragmatic, and so the 5-year plans reflect their assessment of what they can do. But their assessment of what they can do may not turn out to be totally consistent with their actual limits. We do a little bit too much of paying attention to what the Chinese say they want to do, whether it's good, whether we think it's good, or whether we think it's bad, and probably a little too little paying attention to what the Chinese actually can do. Which, if not a better predictor, is at least a pretty strong constraint on what will actually happen.
Anybody else? Okay, let me ask the last question then, and ask you to compare the response of the United States to the Chinese activities in resource acquisition to that of the EU and that of Russia. How have the other powers of the world, so to speak, responded to the Chinese?
I mean, the EU and Russia haven't had to face same set of issues. So the one issue that the United States and the EU, the US and the EU have two things in common in the response, right? So one is their companies are both investing outward and competing with Chinese firms. And responses have been similar, and the United States has done more. The Europeans have been more willing to sort of lower their bar a bit to compete with the Chinese. The United States has been tougher in sticking to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and things like that. The other place where both country and set of countries has responded is in dialing back their own demand, trying to deal with that. And Europeans have been more effective than the United States. The United States has started to catch up in a strong way. But Europe doesn't operate as a great power in the way the United States does, so it doesn't have that piece. And it also isn't an attractive target for resource investment, so it doesn't have the same set of issues. And for the Russians, this is different. So the Russians have some very particular issues that are different. They have to negotiate pipelines. They have to deal with shared waterways. And so they have this ad hoc response to each of those depending on the circumstances. When China pushes up the price of oil, this is not a problem for Russia that it has to deal with. So it's in a very different place. And Russia isn't about Chinese companies doing major investments there. The two countries that actually have a lot in common with some of the emerging challenges for the United States are Australia and Canada, because they have inward investment from these Chinese companies. And they tend to be a little less market fundamentalist about this than the United States. So the Canadians have basically said no more Chinese investment in the oil sands, except in exceptional circumstances. Remains to be determined how exceptional those circumstances actually are. The Australians often talk about trying to get tactical concessions, reciprocal access from China when they, in exchange for allowing investment inward, a kind of commercial, the sort of diplomacy the United States doesn't quite engage in. But less concern in those places about things like proximity to sensitive military installations and things like that. And one of the things that we drive home in the books, when you're thinking about responses, I've just sort of split it into a few pieces here. It's useful to think for each country about the potential response as a consumer, as an investor, as a producer, and as a major power. And I think it's a useful discipline to think, and sometimes a particular development is irrelevant to a particular country when in all four of those areas. Or maybe in three, but not one. And I find it to be a useful discipline for me in thinking through what the appropriate responses are.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for being with us this evening. I'm sure that there's a lot of interest in this book. We have some available, and our guest is going to be signing some for a few minutes if you'd like. And those of you who are staying for dinner, we'll be meeting downstairs at McCormick and Schmick's at 7:30 promptly. Thank you very much.